46 through 49. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? I'll show what it's like when someone comes to me, hears my words, and puts them into practice. It's like a person building a house by digging deep and laying the foundation on bedrock. When the flood came, the rising water smashed against that house, so the water couldn't shake the house because it was well built. But those who don't put into practice what they hear are like a person who built a house without a foundation. The flood water smashed against it, and it collapsed instantly. It was completely destroyed. Let's pray. May my words be of you, and those words that are not of you, may those fall upon deaf ears. Amen. Well, I have a confession. This sermon series that we're launching into is called The Storm Before the Calm. It's a tongue twister because we're so used to saying it the other way, but it's actually based on a series of books that, or a book that one of my mentors wrote, and so it may sound familiar if anyone has read the book. But I wanted to go ahead and get that confession out. He's like, you don't have to confess that to anyone if you don't want to. And I was like, nope, I'm going to confess it. We're going to be honest in church today. So it is based on those books. But last year about this time, I lived in Atlanta. And some of you may have heard on the news what living in Atlanta at this time last year meant. January of last year. Yeah, I was in that. I was sitting in my office at the time, and my boss's office was right next to me, and I was at a church that had a child care center attached to it, and so we're sitting in our offices all nice and comfortable and everything, and we looked out the window, and we're like, oh, it's snowing. How pretty is the snow? And my boss, who's from Iowa, was like, oh, let's just sit here and enjoy it for a while. And so it got to be about noon, and the snow started coming down harder, and it started to become what we call an Atlanta blizzard, which means, of course, that it was sticking. And so at that point, my boss said, well, if you want to go home, then maybe you could go home. I mean, it's starting to stick out there. Maybe we should go ahead and go home. And so I only lived about 2-3 minutes away, and I said, well, I can stay. That's fine. I'll stay, and I'll help out those who live a little further away. And so a couple of my coworkers left, and they lived a little further away, and they did not make it home that night. And that was the story for a lot of people. What had happened was that just like my boss sat and looked out the window at the pretty snow and said, I'm from Iowa. We don't go home, when there's this much snow in Iowa. Every other boss in the city said the same exact thing. And so every other boss let their people go at about noon. So 5 million people in Atlanta hit the roads at noon. And for some reason, Atlanta is not prepared for 5 million people to be on the road at the exact same time. I don't entirely understand why, but we were caught up as a city that was not prepared for the storm that was to come. After all, we're Atlanta, right? We don't have snow plows. We don't have snow. We don't have those things that other cities in the mountains have, for example. And I know that you all saw a little bit of this. In fact, I drove through some of it because I was back and forth at this time last year between Greensboro and Atlanta. And I know that you all saw some of that too, and you got to see Raleigh make the same mistakes that Atlanta made as well, and let everyone go and kind of had the same thing. So the point is, we were all kind of caught unprepared for this storm that was to come. And we were stuck. Many people were stuck overnight. We had people who slept at the church. We had people who slept in their cars. Many people ran out of gas. And when I did finally get out of my house, I went home that night. I was able to make it home. But I was stuck in my house for a couple of days and was walking to the grocery store. And by the time I actually could use my car, you could see just streets littered with all these abandoned cars of people who were so unprepared for the snow that was going to hit in Atlanta. There just was no real plan, and there was so much backlash against the governor and the mayor for not having this plan. Well, why would you let everyone go at noon? Certainly you knew that this was going to happen, but in fact, sometimes you just don't know. He didn't know that we were going to have an Atlanta blizzard. He didn't know that an Atlanta blizzard, which was only at 4 or 5 inches of snow, was going to cause that much chaos. So in Luke 6:48, Jesus tells us about a different kind of storm. It's not a snowstorm, but it's probably more like a hurricane or something with a lot of wind and a lot of rain. And you'll notice Jesus doesn't tell people, though, that if the flood comes. No, he tells them when the storm comes. It's not a if situation, it's a when situation. And the story is told in two places in the Gospel. It's in Luke 6. It's called the Sermon on the Plain, where we read it today. It's also in Matthew 5 through 7, called the Sermon on the Mount. And so it may be familiar for either one of those for some of you. And we're not entirely sure whether it's two accounts of the same story, or whether, Matthew told it one way and Luke told it the other, or if Jesus just preached the same sermon in two places. I don't know of anyone else who ever does that. Maybe Jesus was the pastor of a 2-point charge. We don't really know. But the story, we don't really know, but we know that this story was told in two different ways in these two different Gospels. But anyway, it wasn't snow that day, but instead it was this kind of storm. And so when Jesus tells us about these storms, he doesn't say that it's an if. He says that it's a when. If Atlanta had thought that it was a when situation, that when the snow comes, we'll be prepared, they would have been prepared. But instead, they thought it was an if. Jesus says that it's a when, not an if. The storms will come, and you and I know this very well. All of us are at one of three places. Either we just came through a storm, and we're sitting pretty right now because we can look back on it and say, whew, we got through that one. Or we're sitting in the middle of a storm. We see the torrential rain pour coming around us at this very moment. Or we're heading into one. We all are at one of those three phases, and we all will eventually be at one of those three phases again. The storms will come. For some of us, these storms are beyond our control. They're the cancer diagnosis, the injury, the death, the financial hiccup. But let's not get caught up too much on just the story of these two men. It's important, of course, but what Jesus says at the beginning is even more important. Because Jesus says, why do you want my blessing without obedience? Why do you want all the benefits of following me without following me? Why do you want to boast about me but not surrender to me? Jesus is calling people on the road here. He's saying to put up or, shut up. In that nice Jesus way, of course, because Jesus doesn't use those bad words. He's saying that you can't have it both ways. You can't call yourself a follower without actually following. You can't enjoy the blessing if you aren't going to be the blessing. You can't talk about how amazing Jesus is and then not give Jesus your trust. You can't have it both ways. So why does Jesus say this here? In context of all the storms, it doesn't really make sense, right? Why doesn't he just talk about storms and how to get through it? It's because the story isn't just about the storms. It's about how the men are obedient through those storms. We see these two men building their homes, and in one case, the man builds a home quickly. I used to go on mission trips. I actually was telling a story about one of mine this morning. I used to go on mission trips where we would go and we would repair houses, and you were allowed on these mission trips when you were 14, and so I started when I was 15, actually, and we used to joke that there was the right way to do things, and then there was the way that we did things. The right way, for example, you may put up a shower and use glue to glue the shower on, and then use caulk and make sure everything's straight and use caulk around it and make sure the water works, both sides, both the hot and the cold. The mission trip way, you might just want to make sure that it doesn't leak. Or in my case, you may use the glue as the caulk. I did that once. It still worked, but it wasn't quite right. And so there are two men that Jesus talks about, and one does things the mission trip way. He does things quickly and cheaply, and he just wants them to get done. And in his defense, back then, the sand then was packed pretty tight, and so you couldn't always tell if you were building your house on a firm foundation or if it was just, as the song goes, sinking sand. You couldn't always tell the difference, but he did it so quickly that he didn't check to find out. In the other story, though, the man does things the right way. He digs and he builds and he takes his time. And so when the storm came to the mission trip home, it was demolished. Quickly, it actually says, quickly. In fact, this guy's house was destroyed in less than the amount of time that it took him to build it. Some of you know this very well. Some of you have been through your own storms, and you know what it's like to do things the easy way and get the easy way out of return. You hit the chocolate chip cookies instead of God for support. You asked what's in it for me instead of how can I advance God's kingdom. You knew maybe every song on the radio before you could recite a single letter of Paul. Some of you have been there and some of you still are headed there. But instead we do have this first man in Jesus' story to look to. He is the one who is obedient to Christ. He builds his house on a rock. It does take a lot of effort. It takes a lot of energy. Dig, bore, pour, build, and he's doing it not out of a state of emergency, but not out of necessity, but it's because he trusts Christ so much. He's doing it while things are calm so that he is able to prevail in the storm. In fact, 6:48 reads, his house could not shake. He didn't just survive the storm, but he remained strong in the storm. For those of you who are currently in the calm, how much easier would it be if you went ahead and prepared now? I get it. I've prepared in the storm before too. I've been in the middle of the storm and said, oh, if I had only. You hit rock bottom and all of a sudden God is looking pretty good. But if you prepare in the calm, the rock bottom doesn't hit quite as hard. After all, when you look for spiritual maturity, when you're already at the bottom, your spiritual maturity bar isn't very high. It takes all the energy that you have just to read a little bit more scripture, to pray a little more, to be with people a little more. Some of us have gone through storms that have cut the knees out from under us. Taking the energy to go to God in that time takes all the energy that you have. But when you look for spiritual maturity, when you've already built a foundation, you're ready for some meat upon meat upon meat to prepare you for the time that you will see the bottom. The thing is, storms reveal who we really are. They show our vulnerabilities. They show if we are gluttonous. They show if we are envious. They show if we are wrathful. They show where we are spiritually. But if we are already shored up in our spiritual health, the storm will reveal one who is spiritually healthy. It's the difference between someone who goes to the doctor and is told that they have a lung disease. If they had quit smoking 25 years prior, they are much more likely to overcome it than someone who still is smoking. Or like a student who walks into class for a pop quiz. The one who has studied every day is much more likely to pass than the one who crammed the 5 minutes before. Our faith does actually work the same way. When a storm comes, we're either caught prepared or we are caught unprepared. And for the unprepared, the storm can cut us to our knees. It forces us to look to God, yes, but it feels every bit of a storm. For the prepared, though, the storm is still there. Remember, it's a when, not an if. We will all go through storms. But the prepared person, to the prepared person, their perception of the storm is much different. It looks much more like a sprinkle than a real storm. So how can you prepare? Number one is to get away and to get alone. And I will tell you that this is something that I have a hard time with because I'm such an extreme extrovert that if you put me alone, I'll start talking to myself just so that I have someone to talk to. But your relationship with God is personal. It is you and Him sitting alone in the corner of a room, spending time together daily. And for some of you, it will be discipline. For some of you, this will be the hard part of this. It will be harder than for others. But it is something that will help you shore up for the storms. Number 2 is community, and you're already doing that by being here. But we have other ways here that you can be in community. Men's breakfast we enjoyed this morning, Sunday school classes, and finding just a group of people that you can go out to lunch with or go out to dinner with and say, hey, I really want to be closer to God and closer to you through it. Number 3 is tithe. We are going to spend a lot of time on this right now because I feel like I talk about it a good bit, but it's actually a fact. People who tithe have less money problems. Not because they have more money, but because they have more discipline with the money that they have. God asks us for first fruits, and when you give Him those first fruits, the other finances will actually fall in line behind. And then number 4, and this may be the hardest one of all, is to practice forgiveness. Jesus says this over and over. Love your enemies. Don't get even. When you practice forgiveness, you don't only practice forgiveness with others, but you practice forgiveness with yourself when those storms do come. The storms will come. Cancer will happen. Car wrecks will happen. Injuries will happen. But if you are prepared spiritually, that storm will feel much more like a drizzle than an actual storm.